I'm Hannah.
I'm Suruti.
And konnichiwa are red-handed.
Uh-huh.
We have tried to record this before, and it went so wrong so many times that even opening this document fills me with anxiety and stress.
Yeah.
So it's just bang on.
Let's do it. I believe today is the day. It's happening. We're recording.
I hope so.
I can see you. I can hear you. This is good. We're in two different studios. I'm not just like losing my mind and we're sat in the same room.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yes. We are separate, but we are all going to Japan together, specifically May the 10th, 1936, when a geisha and her lover checked into a hotel. They were totally infatuated with each other, and for the next week, they barely left that hotel room. The non-stop, no-holds-barred lovemaking marathon didn't even stop when maids came into the room to pour them drinks or clean up a bit, and I imagine it was pretty gross in there.
Oh, no.
But then, 9 days later, on the morning of the 19th of May, the geisha left that hotel alone. At 3 p.m., a maid looked in on the room and found the lover. He was dead. And not just dead, mutilated, in fact, lying on a futon. It appeared that he'd been strangled to death with a kimono belt, which is quite apt.
A futon and
also,
a kimono belt. Come on.
Yes, and the next bit is the worst. We've just recorded about meat falling from the sky, and now we're moving on to genital mutilation, because this man's genitals had been severed clean off, and they were nowhere to be found. Naturally, dried blood was pretty much everywhere, specifically his crotch, and then written in blood on the bedsheets in that hotel were the words, Sada and Kichi, alone together. And, most horrifyingly of all, possibly, close second to the chopped-off knob, I would say, the geisha's name, Sada, was carved into the dead man's arm and into his thigh.
Okay, look, if this was some sort of ITV drama, I would be like, who in the fresh fuck wrote this shit? Because you would be like, okay, right, guys, it's in Japan. We've got to set something in Japan. We need to really capture that Japanese market. We'll have a futon. We'll have a kimono belt that's used to strangle him. A geisha. What else is Japanese? There's some...
I mean, the precursor to the love motel, basically, is what this is.
Yes. And then let's also really ham it up with names written in blood on the bedsheets, a name carved into his arm. It just sounds too bonkers and too culturally pigeonholed to sound real.
But a big reason to why it's become so iconic. This is so famous. This is such a famous case, not just in Japan, but like anyone who's,
anyone who's anyone.
I think anyone who's anyone. I think we're all at least peripherally aware of Japanese sex attitudes versus their completely oppressed society, and this blows this wide open, and it's from the 30s. Like, it proves the whole thing.
Absolutely. So let's get into it, because this is the very true story of Abe Sada, the murderous geisha who chopped off her lover's genitals and carried them off, wrapped in her kimono, while she ate some sashimi, possibly. It's Japan's most sensational crime of the 20th century, one that's been retold in countless films and books, and almost become part of Japanese folklore. Imagine if Lizzie Borden had been an insatiably horny sex worker in a kimono, and you're only halfway there.
And just to interject there, geisha are not sex workers, and we will go on to explain that later on, but Abe Sada is both at different points in her life for various reasons. So I just want to interject there before we get shouted at.
Yeah.
Geisha and sex workers are different things.
Good to clarify. So yes, set aside your ideas of a Japanese Lizzie Borden, because much like that kimono that had the severed genitals inside it, this story's lurid details are wrapped up in layer after important layer, sexual expression and repression, and also the meeting of the old samurai-era customs colliding with Western Victorian morality.
In his essay, Mad in Japan, British journalist A.A. Gill wrote, "Sex is where the weirdness of the Japanese peaks, and we've all heard about the dirty knicker vending machines. And also, do you remember when I went to that party and the girl had that really
Yes.
famous tentacle porn tattooed on her back?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that is so intense. But I was like, I've got to get a picture of it because I cannot believe that.
Yeah.
And it was huge and detailed. And like, if you haven't seen it, just Google it and you will have seen it.
Lots of Japanese art featuring all sorts of interesting sex with fish and animals and octopus and
It's quite
prevalent.
tentacly, yeah, more so than other forms, I would say. But I asked her, I was like, oh, so like, what's your connection to Japan? Because she didn't just have that one. She had loads of, what's that rope one? Is she something? She had lots of tattoos displaying distinctly Japanese, very recognizable, different types of porn, basically. And she was like, oh, no, never been. It's like, that's a big commitment.
Yeah, no thanks. There's also that other style of, I don't remember what it's called, but ages and ages and ages ago, do you remember on Under the Duvet or on a main feed, I can't remember, I said I had like started talking to this guy on Hinge years and years ago and how it freaked me out.
Yes, I remember.
Because he was into like that weird, I think it was Japanese, where it's like horror porn or like gore porn, but it wasn't like porn, it's like an artistic thing or whatever. And it was basically like people fucking while they're like, their bodies are falling apart and they're like licking their eyeballs and it's like gross out sex. And I'm sure people are screaming as they were at me on like social media and they were like, it's an art form. You're so narrow-minded. And I was like, mate, you fucking date him then. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. But yeah, no, not for me. Not for me. I just tried to Google it because I couldn't remember what it was called. And I just Googled horror sex Japanese and it is an entire, every single Google search is for a porn website. So I'm just going to close that link now.
Yeah, yeah.
No, thanks.
Our Google searches are incriminating enough. We
Yeah,
don't need more.
let's just close that down. So yeah, lots of weird shit.
And a lot of Western visitors go to Japan and come back a bit baffled. To Western eyes, it can be quite hard to make sense of the more sensationalized side of Japanese sexuality. We've discussed the tentacle porn and celebrations like the Kawasaki Penis Festival. There's also a park that's just big old dicks made out of wood, stone, whatever, you can run around. Actually, no, they have one in Korea as well, but I think the most famous one is in Japan.
What is this penis festival? Oh, wow.
They just love it. Just love it, mate.
Yeah. Google image that. Just like a parade. A parade with lots of dicks.
Yeah.
Lots of people eating like penis ice lollies. Lots of old women holding dicks. It's very unusual.
Yes. And then, of course, the darker side of the upskirting epidemics that are so widespread that anywhere in Asia, I believe, because I had one of these phones, you cannot buy a phone without the camera shutter sound. You cannot turn it off.
That is some practical problem solving, though. I will give them that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I remember when I first bought a phone in Asia and I was like, what the shit, this is so annoying. And then people were like, well, the thing is,
wow,
we're not allowed it. And then also, we've got the images of sexualized manga schoolgirls, and you only have to set foot in the center of Tokyo and Osaka also to see how prevalent they really are. In Osaka, there's a bridge, and these girls, I've watched them, they wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get ready, and then they dress up in these like incredibly elaborate manga schoolgirl childlike costumes, and all they do is stand on the bridge all day and take pictures of each other and then with anyone who wants to take pictures with them, and they're there all day. And like, I don't know how, maybe this has been disproved now, but something I read a lot about in university is this like infantilism thing of like dressing like schoolgirls, not growing up, which also sort of funnels into the teenage boys who never come out of their room, is that once you go to work, your life is really hard.
Yeah.
So it's like staying in this like childlike phase is one theory. Many people disagree with it, but that's just something I thought was interesting. But then also, we see all of these things, and this is the dichotomy, because at the very same time, Japan is as buttoned up as it gets. There is a much widely reported celibacy syndrome in which half of young Japanese women say that they hate even the idea of having sex. And Japan still has some of the most draconian censorship laws when it comes to nudity and sex on screen in the world. So that's why it's so interesting, because sex is everywhere and nowhere. And it's a lot more complicated than its reputation suggests.
And this story maybe illustrates that complication better than anything. So before we get to all the salacious member slicing that I know you're all here for, let's shoot back a few hundred years and talk about Japanese sex work. Obviously, as the world's oldest profession, sex work has been happening in Japan about as long as people have enjoyed shagging. And, money.
And tentacles.
Yes. And through a lot of Japanese history, men were not really expected to be faithful to their wives. The homestead was seen as a place of familial duty above personal love. I would say that's pretty common in most cultures. Marriage and love together as a concept is quite a modern phenomena. Even if you go back to the Victorian times or in lots of places in other parts of the world, those two things aren't together. You marry out of making alliances and things like that, companionship, financial stability, raising a family, not necessarily for love and sex and all that. So, yeah, courtesans, paid mistresses, and trips to the pleasure house were pretty common and not really that shameful. It was seen as an outlet, and sex workers provided not just sex, but also companionship and entertainment. And in the 16th century, the powers that be set up pleasure districts, gathering all of these pleasure houses together in one raunchy place.
Shortly after that, from the 17th century, Japan totally shut itself off from the rest of the world for 265 years. And that period of time is called Sakoku. And we did actually do a full Japanese history rundown in our shorthand on Korean comfort women. And when I say full rundown, I mean it in the way we always mean when we refer to shorthand, which is simplified to an almost offensive degree. Whereas, of course, a lot more reading you can do on the comfort women and Japan itself than our 25-minute shorthand. But anyway, comfort women is a Japanese state-sanctioned sex slavery during World War II, which they have never apologized for. So you can go and listen to that episode if you want to feel really sad. Anyway, during Sakoku, those 265 years, pretty much all contact with other countries was shut down. And during that time, the population of Japan, which is famously in big trouble these days, completely thrived, and as did Japanese culture, because there was no outside influence coming in. Japanese beliefs and ideals are based on a mixture of things. We've got Confucianism, Buddhism, Shintoism. And what Shintoism is all about is that objects, places, and creatures all have their own spirit. And that is a religion native to Japan. It is from there. It grew there. It didn't come in from anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. So during that time, a lot of traditional Japanese art forms flourished as well, including dance, theatre, and music. And by the mid-18th century, all this inspired the idiosyncratic art of the geisha. So yes, it's time to demystify the wonderful world of geisha. So what exactly are they? And more to the point, are they sex workers? Well, yes and no, but mostly no. Like we said, the first geisha started performing in the mid-1700s. And the first geisha were actually men. But after 100 years or so, they were all women. And their job was simply to entertain people who came to the pleasure quarters. The geisha's job was to relax customers into the evening. They'd put on musical performances or dances and put guests at ease before customers went on to get their rocks off with the real sex workers. After all, who wants to go straight from a long day at the factory, straight down to bonking? You want to have a drink first, maybe a chat, and enjoy a song or two. That's what the geisha are for. And the word geisha actually comes from gei, meaning arts or skills, and sha, meaning person. So their job was, and still is, essentially to pour drinks, make sparkling conversation, laugh at their guests' jokes, and perform their dance or specific skill.
They're the French bulldog of the Japanese pleasure quarter.
Yes, I was going to say that, and I thought people might be offended. But yes, the French bulldog, famously the fluffer of the French brothel back in the day. That's what they were bred for. Basically for men who would come in and feel a little bit awkward. And so here, have a French bulldog sit on your lap and warm yourself up. And then, let's get down to business.
In the early years, some classes of geisha did end up having sex with their clients, and the lines got a little blurry. But Mostly, geisha were high-class, impeccably dressed, ideal dinner guests. They were, and still are, trained from a very young age in elegant dances, note-perfect singing, politeness, good conversation, the tea ceremony, obviously, huge deal. They take lessons in art history and religion, so their witty repartee with the upper echelons of the male society is pretty top-notch. Their kimono, makeup, and hair are always intricate and beautiful, and it takes hours to get it all right. So geisha were the height of fashion for a long time. Their tight, restrictive kimono and elevated wooden slippers made it very difficult to walk and even harder to dance, so what they're doing is really impressive, especially when their standards of poise and grace are so high and their job is to make it look easy, which it isn't. So, from the very beginning, despite their association with the pleasure quarters, geisha were also considered to be the absolute peak of elegance and class. In some ways, geisha were a lot more liberated than other Japanese women. They were financially independent, they had job security for life, and they had a lot more personal freedom than the average Japanese housewife, and I don't think those are insignificant things.
But we're leaping ahead slightly. It's more important to say that today, geisha are totally separated from sex work. And it's been that way for a good while now. During World War II, sex workers in kimonos would approach American GIs, and they became known as geisha girls, which they weren't. And that spread the idea that geisha were just high-class sex workers. These days, real geisha work in designated houses called okiya, which hold tea parties for paying guests. They're basically hired party guests, perfect hosts in a fantasy world where high-powered salarymen go to relax. And though they might stroke your ego and do some gentle flirting, it's understood that it's all a fantasy, and sex is very much off the table. Geisha also don't partake in any of the food, but they are expected to drink along with the guests and take part in all sorts of sake-heavy drinking games. And that's before they flawlessly perform their dance routines, staying demure and graceful throughout. So they really have to be able to hold their booze.
Anyway, we are almost done with our history lesson, so let's jump back to the 19th century. When the US arrived to Japan with big bad warships, the Japanese knew that its isolation was over. And it wasted no time in jumping whole hog into becoming a world power. Japan knew that if it didn't get with the program, it was in danger of being colonized, so instead, it started trying to fit in with the new, westernized global world order. A lot of Japan's old beliefs associated with Buddhism and Shintoism were suddenly considered immoral, old-fashioned, and even corrupt. So instead, the Japanese took on all sorts of Western Victorian-era ideas like chastity, philosophical enlightenment, and civility, and also colonizing everyone else. Around the start of the 20th century, Japan had two major wins. They managed to snatch Korea off the Chinese, and they also got a big chunk of Russia from the Russians.
Even then, the ruling classes in Japan was still the descendants of old samurai families. Power had been strictly handed down from father to son for centuries. So taking on Western attitudes of faithfulness and chastity outside of wedlock kind of suited them down to the ground. It's a great way to avoid any pesky Game of Thrones-style bastard heirs from grabbing at the throne. But out in the sticks, it was still pretty old school. There, women were far more independent. They worked out in the fields with the men. They could earn their own money and even own their own property. And they were pretty sexually active. Sex before marriage was incredibly common. Surprise pregnancies weren't particularly shameful. And divorce and remarriage were perfectly fine.
But in 1889, the powers that be clamped down in the shape of a reform movement that called for civilization and enlightenment. Monogamy, chastity, and filial piety were the name of the game. As well as suiting the aristocracy for sex reasons, it also made people more subservient and loyal to the emperor, which obviously worked pretty well for him. Plus, Japan looked all civilized, quote unquote, to the rest of the world when they came knocking. All sorts of new moral texts were written and distributed, and in one fell swoop, many women were stripped of their rights that they'd enjoyed for as long as anyone could remember. They were suddenly just gone, and that meant the sudden separation of women into two very distinct classes. First, there was the household woman, the wife, mother, head of the household, and then the second class of women, the fallen ones, who, through some shameful act or other transgression, had fallen into disrepute. These women were totally unsuitable for marriage, but still considered sexually attractive and, above all, available.
And all of this is to say that the period between about 1850 and the start of the Second World War was a time of massive social change. Mostly, it was a big effort to get in line with Western customs at absolute breakneck speed, after a long, long time keeping themselves to themselves. And that sort of cultural whiplash that Japanese culture experienced goes some way to explain the apparent double standards that still prevail today. And it was among all this that Abe Sada was born.
Sometimes she's referred to in English as Sada Abe with her surname last, but in Japan, she was Abe Sada, and it also sounds nicer, and it's correct, so we're going to stick with it. Abe Sada was born in 1905 in the Kanda neighborhood of Tokyo. Her family made tatami, which is the woven surface used on the floors of Japanese houses. Craftsmanship is particularly well respected in Japan, and the Abes were skilled at what they did. So, as a result, they were very well off. Abe Sada's parents both steered clear of alcohol, and they were faithful to each other. They had no dealings with any dodgy activities at all, ever. And that's probably because they were quite busy with their 8 children. Although, having said that, only 4 of those kids made it to adulthood. Due to a series of babies that didn't make it to their first birthday, Abe Sada was the youngest by far of her siblings, and she was completely spoiled as well. Her mother encouraged the young Abe to be independent and free-spirited. Seems like a very dance mom's energy. She was very proud of her daughter's beauty. She dressed her up, she paraded her around, and she was living out her fantasies through her daughter.
At school, Sada was lazy, and her grades were, sadly, pretty terrible. But she showed real promise in her singing lessons and playing the shinkasen, which is a very olden-timey traditional Japanese guitar, which will come up later.
It's very impressive, very complicated instrument.
Mm-hmm. And her brother, Shintaro, was known around town as a real sleazeball womanizer. He'd steal money from the family business and spend it all on wild, drunken benders. And his parents always turned a blind eye. But their elder sister, Teroku, was not given the same grace. Teroku had an affair at a pretty early age, and later was casually dating 3 separate guys at once. So, her father sold Teroku to a brothel.
Does seem quite harsh, doesn't it?
It is, isn't it? And Teroku actually stayed in indentured servitude there for 2 years, until her father finally decided that she'd learned her lesson and bought out the rest of her contract. It's kind of like she's sleeping with these guys, so he's like, right, I'm selling you to a brothel. It's kind of like you get caught with a cigarette and your mum makes you like smoke the entire pack.
It's exactly that, yes.
Now, this is a pretty stark example for the young Abe Sade who's watching what happened to her sister, of the difference between men and women in her family and also in wider society. And soon enough, she felt it firsthand too.
When Abe Sada's parents started big-time arguing about the family inheritance, they encouraged Abe Sada to start spending more time outside of their house with her friends. And one night, when she was out with an acquaintance, a student at Kyoto University, he forced himself on her and he raped her, and she was just 15. In the days afterwards, she was filled with a furious sense of injustice, especially when the man's parents refused to even speak to her parents about what happened. This guy, this student, was from an upper-class family, and he didn't want his reputation to be tarnished by what he had done, and neither did his parents, and it is so depressing, please see our episode on Brock Turner, that we don't seem to have moved on at all. Anyway, I can't let myself go down that route because I'll have another tantrum. Anyway, it is also worth pointing out that rape at the time in Japan was very low down the police's priority list, so not only was Abesada furious, she knew that there was no point in going to the police. She wouldn't be taken seriously. So now, at just 15, Abe could see as plain as day how much her gender and her class were stacked against her. She also knew that in many people's eyes, what had happened, against her will, had tarnished her for life. Abe actually had a boyfriend at that time, but after she was raped, he left the area and he never spoke to her again. Her marriage prospects were very low. At just 15, Abe was already a fallen woman, and it was completely out of her control.
She later said in her police interview that after the assault, quote, "my attitude changed, and I started to go around Asakusa with a bunch of delinquents. What happened drove me to desperation." And from then on, she showed a lot of common signs of a victim of assault that didn't get the right help. Trauma, difficulty trusting people, and rebelliousness in an attempt to take back control. Abesada started stealing money from her family to take her friends out on the town. And once, her parents locked her in her room to try and stop her, but she escaped through the window and went out anyway.
Her parents, not sure what to do about anything, got her a job as a servant. She worked as a maid to the daughter of a wealthy family, and Abesada hated it, and she also hated how lonely she was. She was being forced to eat in the kitchen while the family enjoyed the meal that she had made in the next room. So, one night she went into the wealthy daughter's room, put on one of her finest kimono and a bunch of her jewelry, and just went out on the town, for which she was obviously fired, and it also turned out to be her first of many run-ins with the police. Her father said that she had some kind of, and this is a quote, sexual dementia, which was the main reason she got into so much trouble. So, her parents, once again unsure what they were going to do with her, reached for the only other card in their problem daughter deck, and they sold her into indentured servitude. In 1922, at the age of 17, Abesada was sent to an okiya, a geisha house in Yokohama.
Now, at first, Abesada was not totally bummed out by this move, especially considering that her older sister had been sent straight to a brothel instead. Like we said, geisha were pretty glamorous. The art and fashions of high-ranking geisha were imitated across the country. Plus, from a very young age, Abesada had also learned exactly the kind of classical dance and music that were studied and performed by the geisha. And then there was the much less fun reason that she later put this way: "My body is already filthy. I don't care anymore." Still, becoming an accomplished geisha was a real mark of distinction. And Sada finally saw a path forward for herself. Maybe everything would be all right.
Except, because of the way we have structured this episode, we know that, all right, it certainly would not be. Initially, Abesada enjoyed the geisha training and her musical education, but the reality of geisha life was just waiting round the corner. Even though she'd been just 17 when she started, most of the girls her age had already been training for years. They'd grown up and been raised, immersed in the geisha system. So Abesada was just never ever going to be the best. And being a low-ranking geisha back then meant that customers felt a lot more comfortable asking for sex. And the geisha bosses wouldn't always stop them. So Abesada started sleeping with her customers, and after a few years, kind of inevitably, she got syphilis. Which was incurable back then, but controllable. So she was allowed to keep working, as long as she had regular health inspections, which I don't imagine was that rare.
God. Now, geisha, as a rule, did not have to undergo these inspections, but sex workers did. So now that Abe Sada had to have them, and since she was selling sex anyway, she eventually decided to turn to sex work. After all, the money was better. So at the age of 21, she left the Okia and joined a state-licensed brothel in Osaka. But once there, she soon realized why the money was better. Because brothel life was way, way, way worse. Geisha had a reputation on their side, and clients treated them with respect. They were given some degree of control over their encounters as well. But now, in this brothel, Abe Sada found herself treated like an object. She started stealing, and when she was caught and punished, she ran away. Since she was still paying out her contract with the brothel, though, she had to lay low.
In 1934, when an unlicensed brothel she worked at was raided by police, Abe Sada was bailed out by a well-connected friend of the owner, Kinosuke Kasahara. Kinosuke fell for Abe Sada really quickly, and she was his mistress for quite a while. She started to realize that sex could be not something that was just demanded of her and something that she sold, but something she enjoyed a lot. In fact, she and Kinosuke had to end things when her demands of him in the bedroom got too much for him. And years later, Kinosuke would testify that Abe Sada was, quote, a woman whom men should fear. He went on to say she wasn't satisfied unless we did it 2, 3, or 4 times a night. To her, it was unacceptable unless I had my hand on her private parts all night long. At first, it was great, but after a couple of weeks, I got a little exhausted. That sounds awful. My God.
It does sound awful. I'm upset.
Having said that, it does become quite difficult to separate the truth from the legend in the story of Abe Sada because so much of it, because of quotes like that from men who were afraid of her, have mythologized her story. But what is clear for everyone to see is that from this point on, Abe Sada was pretty insatiably randy all of the time. It doesn't ever seem to stop.
Now, apart from the fact that Kinosuke couldn't keep up, Abe Sada eventually ended things because she wanted to settle down and finally get some permanence in her life. And she knew that he'd never leave his wife. They also argued over the financial aspect. As a paid mistress, it was all too transactional for her liking. But having had a taste of the relationship life, Abe Sada decided to leave sex work completely and move to Nagoya to get a job as a server in a restaurant, which is where she met Goro Omiya, the soft boy of the piece. Goro was a professor and banker with lofty political aspirations, and the two began a real whirlwind romance. Goro genuinely seemed to care for Abe Sada. He was concerned for her well-being and would talk to her at length about her future plans. It was Sada's first real taste of proper romantic love, but they had to keep it all under wraps. Firstly, Goro was a regular in the restaurant she worked in, which was very protective of its we're not a brothel reputation. So her fucking a customer would have meant big trouble. Plus, her past wouldn't be a great look if Goro ever did fancy running for office. Still, the relationship was doomed to fail anyway. Because once again, Goro could not satisfy Sada sexually.
But the ever-supportive Goro did promise that he would help Abe Sada to leave the sex industry for good. And he had a plan. He was going to buy her a restaurant to run herself. Abe Sada had seen women running restaurants before, and she admired their financial and emotional independence. But although she had been a waiter for a bit, she didn't have that much experience in running a place. So, Goro set her up with an apprenticeship at a Tokyo restaurant called Yoshidaya. And it was all looking great. Abe Sada was making way more than she'd ever made as a sex worker, even still as an apprentice. Everything was going perfectly, steadily. But pretty incapable of stability. What's the word? maintenance.
Yeah.
Stability is not her home, really, is it? I
No.
don't think she knows that much to do with it.
No, I think one thing that becomes quite clear with Abe Sada is that she's definitely drawn to the chaos and the drama of it all.
Yes, and that is exactly what happens. Even though Goro and her probably aren't having sex anymore because he can't keep up, he is still supporting her. He still found her this job a la the bear. But she fell for the restaurant's owner anyway, a 42-year-old called Ishida Kuchiso. A womanizer, a layabout, and owner of perfectly intact genitalia. For now.
Now, although Ishida owned the restaurant, by all accounts, he did absolutely fuck all. And it was actually run day to day by his wife, a toku. Ishida seems to just have sat around being lechy to the waitresses. And it wasn't long after Abe Sada started that he started making advances towards her. He'd block her in the hallway, make a barrage of lewd comments, or grab her as she passed him. When she once stayed out late 2 nights in a row, he pushed her against a wall, bit her earlobe, and pressed his knee into her.
The knee thing, it's now considered entirely to be a lesbian move.
Oh.
It's a thing.
Is it? Never heard of it.
Yes. We run in slightly different circles. If you can master the knee thing,
Right.
top tier.
Oh, right.
Top tier.
Top tier lesbian. I see.
Top tier.
Shagger.
Lady who likes the ladies? Yeah. Oh, top shagger for sure.
Okay, got it.
Top tier, yeah.
Got it. Okay, so to me, I was reading this, I was like, that sounds horrible. That sounds awful. But
it's not awful, trust me.
Okay, so some people might like it. And Abe Sada was one of those because she was extremely into it.
It's all about the timing.
I see. So one day, Ishida's wife told Abe there was a customer waiting for her in the annex. She went in with a bottle of sake to find Ishida himself sitting there. When she leant in to pour him a drink, he grabbed her and started kissing her. He then ordered a geisha in to sing them an old song, which sent Abe Sada into an absolute creative rapture. And when the geisha left, Ishida and Abe Sada had sex for the first time.
So, let's talk about the wife, briefly. It does seem like Ishida did get her involved with his little sex operation. But as we said, this separation between wife, sexless homemaker, and mistress, sexy side piece, was quite common. So his wife was just probably kind of over the whole thing. And before long, Abby and Ishida, who she called Kichi, as we know, were sneaking off during work hours all the time to do it in the back room. And because they were totally shameless and didn't really try and hide that much, they were caught quite often. Too many times, actually, so they started to head off to tea houses where they could just shag away at their heart's content. And we should mention that tea house was often a euphemistic way to refer to little inns that specialised in renting rooms for sex, which are the precursors to the famous love hotels that Japan have now, and also most of Asia, I would say. And it's not always particularly... I've stayed in loads of love motels, not because I was shagging, because they were cheap.
Oh, yeah. When I was traveling in Asia with one of my good friends, we were in, I want to say we were in the Philippines. And obviously we were taking a lot of like little flights in between the islands. And it would just be very inconvenient. We're like, oh, we've just got like a few hours to kill. I just want to lie down somewhere. And you can get those just like book by the hour hotels, which are obviously, you know, for shagging. And we would book into them together and you would just get all these looks and be like, we're just here to sleep. We're just here to sleep. There was one place I will never, ever forget in Manila that was, every room was themed with some sort of weird fantasy setup. And we get there and the guy is like, so what theme do you want? And he was just like showing us this booklet of all of the different rooms. And it was in part funny, which is why we kept looking at them. But I was also like, I literally just want to go to sleep. And now I feel so grossed out. Because that is one of the things, right? You go into this room and I don't even remember. I think we just ended up in this heart-themed room. And the realization of what you're in, as opposed to if it's just an ordinary hotel room that you know is used for shagging, but one that is so obviously there for shagging because of this fantasy setup, makes for quite uncomfortable getting into the bed to go to sleep feelings for me, I would say.
I try not to think about it. Anyway, even though they were getting caught all the time, it seemed like Abe Sada had finally met her sexual match. According to some people, the first time Abe Sada and her new lover got a room together, they had non-stop, day and night, sex for 2 weeks, which, as previously discussed, sounds awful.
Kill me.
And as we already told you, even when maids came in, they didn't stop. They were totally obsessed with each other, and Ishida started confiding in Abe Sada things that he'd never even told his wife. Specifically, about the massive debts he owed on his restaurant that his wife didn't know about. And perhaps kinkily of all, Ishida invited Abe Sada to stop addressing him in formal language.
Oh my God.
I know.
Ooh. So, due to the aforementioned massive debts on the restaurant, heading out to hotels for weeks at a time is a pretty pricey lifestyle. But not to worry, because occasionally, Abe Sada would take the train to Nagoya to visit good old Gora Omiya and lie to him to get him to give her some money. Then she'd head back to Tokyo for another non-stop sex hotel sesh with Ishida, not even stopping to eat or bathe. Bathe? Oh my God.
That's very important. I hope she was weeing in between,
I
otherwise
know.
you're getting a UTI straight away, mate.
Wee before, wee after, and bathe.
Just wee
Please.
as much as you can.
Yeah, just if you're into it, during, but not weekends. Now, with their new funds tricked out of Mr. Gora Omiya, the couple also started ordering geisha to their room to perform for them. But even these two couldn't stay up there shagging forever. And every time Ishida returned to his wife, Abe Sada sank into herself a bit more. She later said this: "It's hard to say exactly what was so good about Ishida, but it was impossible to say anything bad about his looks, his attitudes, his skill as a lover, the way he expressed his feelings. I had never met such a sexy man." Her infatuation had become an obsession, and she couldn't bear the idea of him being with another woman. So soon, Abe Sada turned to the bottle. She dreamt of running away with him, but knew that he would never leave his wife. And on one of those evenings when she was alone, she thought about his death for the first time. She even later testified, "I came to think all the more about killing him, to the point that there was no stopping me." And I would say that those last few words do sound an awful lot like premeditation, given what we know is about to happen.
Given what we know, yes, but on its own, possibly not. Conspiracy to commit, perhaps.
So on the 9th of May 1936, Abe Sada went to the theatre. The play was called Shinshaku Tsuya ya Monogatari, or, in English, New Tales of the Erotic. And it featured a scene in which a geisha attacked her lover with a knife. 2 days later, Abe Sada bought a knife of her own.
The next time she saw Ishida, she whipped out the knife and threatened him with it. But it didn't necessarily have totally the desired effect, or maybe it did, I don't know what game she's playing. Didn't really scare him, it turned him on instead. And another time, while they were having sex, Abe Sada held the knife to the base of his penis, and she told him that she would make sure that he would never play around with other women ever again. And do you remember who else said that?
No.
Estella Sexton. Eddie Lee Sexton and Estella Sexton are living in Little Manors Estate Park, and they find all those letters, and she's like, if you ever, if I die and you end up with someone else, I'm coming back to cut a bit off you, is what she says.
I remember.
Anyway, he was not afraid. He just laughed. And in a way, it's not particularly surprising that he wasn't too taken aback. As well as their insane stamina, Abe and Ishida had been upping the kinky stakes, which, I mean, you're gonna get bored. You just are. If you're shagging 24/7 for 2 weeks on end doing the same shit, you are.
It's just, where does it end? Where does it end?
We know where it ends. She kills him. Anyway, they start fairly low-key, in my opinion, with a bit of autoerotic asphyxiation. Well, no, just erotic asphyxiation, because she's doing it to him with a kimono belt. He liked it so much that they carried on messing around with the asphyxiation thing for about 2 hours, which is so dangerous. But it became something of a favourite of theirs, even when it did go quite badly wrong. And if you thought knife penis gate was enough of a sign for them to calm down, it absolutely was not. Once, when Abe Sada was strangling her lover, she did it a little bit too hard, and he went limp, and his eyes became bloodshot and swollen, and he passed out. When he came back around, he was clearly in quite a lot of pain, but they both agreed that they couldn't go to hospital because the doctors might tell the police. So instead, Abe Sada just shoved him in the bath to cool down a bit and then went to a pharmacy. I don't know why she trusted the pharmacist more than a hospital doctor, but she did. And this pharmacist told her that Ishida would take a month to return to normal.
Wow. Yeah. Currently in the UK, we're trialing a situation, right, where you cannot get a GP appointment because everything's fucked. So you just go to the pharmacist if you need things like antibiotics. So they will give you antibiotics if you've got like a chest infection, a UTI, or tonsillitis, as I discovered over the new year. I didn't know that they could also give you advice on how long it takes to recover from being strangled by a kimono belt for 2 hours. A month.
Well,
it's going to take a month.
She's got syphilis. They ain't giving her antibiotics. They haven't got them yet.
Oh, yeah. So it's a long time, as the pharmacist tells them, before Ishida's going to be okay. And it was only now that the pair finally got a bit spooked. Though not because of the clear and present danger to, life, but rather because they were running out of cash and couldn't stay away from the restaurant for another full month. So while they wondered what to do, on the 8th of May, 1936, they checked into the Masaki Tea House. 9 days later, most of Ichizo would leave in a body bag. Because on the night of the 18th of May, Ishida started talking to Abe Sada about his children and how important they were to him. After he fell asleep, Abe lay awake. She couldn't shake the idea that no matter how close the couple got, Ishida would never leave his life at the restaurant. She even wondered about a suicide pact, but knew he'd never agree to that, because obviously he didn't want to abandon his children that he loved so much. So, at around 2 a.m., Abe Sada sat up and squeezed her obi around his throat. When she couldn't stop shaking, she threw back some sake, squeezed harder, and tied a knot in the belt to ensure that Ishida would die. She would later say that once it was done, she felt totally at ease, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and felt a sense of clarity. After he stopped moving, Abe Sada lay down next to his corpse, and finally, briefly, fell asleep.
Okay, Dennis, how are you going to sleep? Anyway, she wasn't asleep for long, and a la Dennis Nilsson, as soon as she woke up, she started fondling the dead body next to her. And when she realised that her time was probably up and she was going to need to leave, she decided that she was going to take her dead lover's genitals with her. So she went and got her knife and she chopped them off. And then, with the same knife, she carved the characters for Sada and Kichi Ishida alone together into his thigh. And using the blood that flowed out from the wound, subsequently, she wrote that same message again, in blood, on a bedsheet. And she carved her name into his arm.
Just to be sure. Just to be totally sure.
Belt and braces.
Yeah.
Kimono, belt and braces.
Yeah. Isn't there something in, Japanese mythology, folklore, that if the body isn't whole, it can't go to heaven?
No, that's Catholics, I think.
I thought there was something in
it might
about
be.
That. Maybe. But she's like, even if you get to heaven, you're not fucking anyone else, because I've got your dick.
That's the point, I think.
And my name is carved on your arm.
Yes. So everyone's going to know in this life and the next.
Mm-hmm.
Then she put on Ishida's underwear and put her clothes on over the top and tore off the front page of a magazine, wrapped her genital prize inside it, and then folded it all into her kimono and just went downstairs and told the staff at front desk not to disturb him. And then she left.
But eventually they were going to disturb him. And it was the next day at around 3 p.m. when a maid looked into the room and saw Yoshida dead on the futon. A press release sent out by police spread like absolute wildfire. And to explain why, we kind of have to catch you up with what's been going on outside those paper-thin tea house walls. Because while Abe Sada and Ishida only had eyes for each other, the rest of Japan was in absolute turmoil. This was 1936, and earlier that year, a pro-emperor military uprising had stormed government buildings and murdered several prominent politicians. The country was also in the midst of their second war with China, and Korea was resisting occupation. Japan, just like the rest of the world, was gearing up for the mother of all conflicts. So, to a country surrounded by war, the story of what Abe Sada had done in that tea house was a pretty welcome distraction.
So much so they decided to write very, very long headlines about it. One of them goes like this: grotesque murder in Ogu red light district. Blood characters carved in master's corpse. Beautiful maid disappears following love tryst.
It is a lot to cover in a headline. There is a lot that happens.
Yes, that's true. And let's face it, if anything's going to take your mind off the war, this story will do it. The following day, the press released more details about the woman they called an enchantingly beautiful flower of evil. Is that better than the Black Peril? I think it might be.
I think it might be.
And the press revealed that Abe Sada had been trained as a geisha, had ties to a prominent politician. So yes, poor old Goro's political career was over well before it began. I don't know why he thought he was going to be able to hide it.
No.
More lurid details about Abe Sada and Ishida's sex marathons came out in the press over the following days. And that meant that the public only got more hysterical. Word spread about a crazed ex-geisha running around Tokyo slicing off genitals. And the public panic about this incredibly sexually dangerous woman meant, as it always does, that there were hundreds of false sightings of Abe Sada from all over the country. One of these sightings just so happened to have been in the Ginza shopping district of Tokyo, which is a very busy place. And because somebody thought they had spotted the danger geisha on the loose, there was a public stampede.
That's bonkers. It's not like they thought she had a gun. She just got a knife that they think she might cut someone's dick off, and there was a public stampede. But sticking with the investigation, rather than all these various sightings, police discovered that after Abe Sada had left the tea house, she'd gone to see her sugar daddy, Goro Omiya, one last time. Goro told police that she'd apologized profusely, though he had no idea what for.
Well, for ruining your career.
Yeah, because he would later realize that she was saying sorry for leading him on, stealing his money, and telling everyone that he was bad at sex and totally ending his longed-for political career. But then, at around 5:30 p.m. on the 20th of May, 2 days after she'd left that hotel, the search unexpectedly came to a close. Police were doing a routine check of a hotel near Shinagawa Station when they discovered a strange name on the register. Officers asked to be shown to the room, and when they got there, Sada told them who she was immediately. Now, at first, they didn't actually believe her, but then when she unwrapped a severed penis from her kimono, it kind of put the investigation to bed.
It's quite the calling card, isn't it? So, where had she been? After she left the hotel, Abe Sada went shopping for a change of clothes. And then she went off to see her sugar daddy wannabe politician Goro Omiya to apologize to him. We already know that. What we didn't know is what Goro Omiya had helpfully left out in his police report was that he and Abe Sada had had sex once she got there.
Oh, no.
What difference does it make at this point, really?
True. Maybe she need him.
Don't think it works for blokes.
Oh, never mind.
Later that same day, Abe Sada checked into a second hotel in Shinagawa under a fake name. There, she got a massage, drank some beers, and then she fell asleep and decided that she was going to take her own life. To do so, she would travel up to Kansai and jump off a cliff on Mount Ikumo. Naturally, with Ishida's penis in her hand. She wasn't leaving that behind for someone else to pick up. She spent the rest of the following day writing farewell letters. And when she was done with her correspondence, she did what you probably have been waiting for her to do, to be honest.
Why? Even after a decade doing this, I didn't even think that what you're about to say next is what she was going to do. Did not think that was what was coming next.
Well,
I've just read ahead in the script.
And, I mean, obviously, the case that leaps to mind is Lorena Bobbitt, but Lorena Bobbitt did absolutely no such thing.
No.
Because what Abe Sada did is that she attempted to have sex with a severed penis, and she put it in her mouth as well.
Bit more Ed Kemper.
Reverse Ed Kemper, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But before she could really get going, the police arrived. And there is a very famous photo of Abe Sada minutes after she is arrested, and I would invite you to have a look. Not asked, mate. Not asked at all.
No one in this picture is asked. What am I looking at?
No, that's true.
What am I looking at? This is bonkers.
But she doesn't look like dissociated or like worried or even
Chill.
In some sort of like state where she's not really there. She knows exactly what she's just done and she doesn't care.
Chill as fuck. Why are all the police officers smiling? Why is everyone in this picture smiling?
That I don't know. That I can't explain.
Like, they are... It's not even just like an awkward smile of like, or a relieved smile, like we caught her, whatever. They're positively jolly in this picture. It's very, very strange.
It is quite odd. Maybe the police are like, this is my 15 minutes.
Maybe.
I'm going to hang this picture in my house. I want to be smiling.
Maybe. Or, she is an ex-geisha. Maybe she just told them a great joke or something. Or, I don't know. They are having a fucking great time. It would have to
be a pretty good joke.
Watch me make this penis disappear. I don't know. That's fucking horrible. Anyway, the next day, Abe Sada was interrogated and asked why she had killed Ishida. To which she said, "I loved him so much. I wanted him all to myself. But since we were not husband and wife, as long as he lived, he could be embraced by other women. But I knew that if I killed him, no other woman could ever touch him again." As for why she cut his cock and balls off, she said, "They were the dearest and most important part of him. Since I couldn't take his head or body, I wanted to take the part of him that brought back the most vivid memories."
A head is more difficult to smuggle out of a hotel in a kimono, one would argue.
Yes, very much so. Plus, she also added, she did it so his wife could never touch it again. I don't know that his wife is going to touch his dead penis, but sure.
Yeah.
And Abe Sada also told police that when she killed Ishida, it seemed that he became a part of her, and she felt relieved. By this point, she was already a household name around Japan, but it was this sentiment, essentially, that made her a superstar. William Johnston wrote a book called Geisha, Harlot, Strangler, Star about Abe Sada's life.
Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Quite. And he suggests in this book that what made Abe Sada so fascinating to the Japanese public was that she had killed not out of jealousy, but out of love. I would argue that she did kill out of jealousy. I don't think that she didn't kill out of jealousy.
She's quite clear about it.
Yeah.
She's not, like, mysterious in her reasoning.
Yeah, she's like, I don't want any other woman to fucking touch him. I'll cut his penis off. I would say that's a touch of the green-eyed monster. And it also probably added to, the public's obsession with Abe Sada because her detailed confession, in which she admitted to everything, was later published in full. And it actually became a bestseller in Japan.
All sorts of 1930s psychoanalysts had a go at making sense of what Abe Sada did. They talked about the 4 major perversions, which are sadism, masochism, fetishism, and nymphomania. And we've got another psychoanalyst focused on the penis slicing, because why wouldn't you? Psychoanalysts, penis obsessed, quite famously. And he wanted to know whether it was out of a desire to control Ishida, which Again, this seems quite obvious. A lot of other analysts thought about Abiy Ashida's mother spoiling her too much as a child and therefore raising a delinquent. But then there were others who said that it was just an example of love taken to an extreme. Those are all quite old-timey, as I'm sure you can gather, because they're not particularly in-depth or interesting. More recently, psychoanalysts have said that Abiy Sada might actually have been experiencing a full psychotic episode. But we're not totally sure. Psychotic breaks are defined by a total disassociation from reality or an unshakable belief in something that's untrue, like Saruti's boyfriend Richard Chase thinking he was a vampire, etc. So that means hallucinations, extreme mental confusion, and sudden inexplicable actions that only make sense within the world of the delusion. But I don't really think that's what happened. Abiy Sada knew exactly what she was doing.
Yeah, she reminds me a lot more of like Armin Meiwes, all right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I'm not just saying because of the penis slicing. If you guys don't remember that case, we covered it, God, years and years ago. And it is, of course, God, he had so many names. The butcher of whatever. Anyway, he was the German guy, the German cannibal who found Brandt Wilders or something like that. The other guy, the victim, online invited him to his house, and then they decided they were going to cut off and eat his penis together. Horrifying stuff. Go check out our episode on that, wherever it may be. And it was that desire, right, of Armin Meiwes who wanted to possess this other person completely, wanted to consume him, wanted him to be a part of him. He'd suffered with loneliness as a child. He'd always been alone. And he basically couldn't deal with this idea of this other person leaving him. And he wanted in any way to feel like he could just keep him with him forever. I'm not saying it's the exact same thing, but that is kind of what comes to mind going through this story.
I think a bit of a difference, but I believe you totally, and I agree. The difference, I would say, is that Armin Meiwes didn't really care who the person was.
That's
he just
true.
didn't want to be alone.
Yeah.
It didn't matter who the person was, whereas Abiy Sada really cared who the person was.
True.
And also, we've got the premeditation. I don't know whether that would specifically, on its own, cancel out psychotic delusion.
No.
She does describe herself as being clear-minded, and also she had a plan to kill herself afterwards because she couldn't see a way forward, and she decided to end it in the only way that she thought was amenable.
So unsurprisingly, at trial, Abiy Sada pleaded guilty. She was convicted of second-degree murder and with the mutilation of a corpse. She testified that although she'd had sex with many men in her life, her victim was her first true love. She said that she'd become obsessed with controlling him, the way a man controls a woman. She said that murder was the only way to monopolize him, and that's the best translation of the word that she used that we could find. Now, the court did cite a disassociation with reality and recognized her as insane. Abiy Sada was actually hoping for the death penalty. The prosecution was hoping for at least 10 years. She was sentenced to a classically Japanese, shockingly low term of just 6 years.
In prison, Abiy Sada received more than 10,000 fan letters and several marriage proposals. In 1940, the emperor issued a large-scale amnesty to celebrate the 2600th anniversary of the Japanese Empire. And as a part of that celebration, Abiy Sada had the final year of her already quite short sentence commuted entirely. So after 5 years, Abiy Sada was released from prison in 1941. Commuting sentences in a celebration of an anniversary is clutching at straws, isn't it?
Especially for a crime like this. It's not like you're letting go of people who have, like, I don't know, spoken out against the emperor and you're showing all this mercy or something. Like, she killed a guy and cut his penis off. Why did she need to get out?
Was she the only person imprisoned in Japan? Anyway, during the war, for obvious reasons, and censorship also, Abiy Sada's story disappeared for a while. There was quite a lot of other shit going on. But in the years after the Second World War, Abiy Sada once again rose to cultural obsession status in Japan. A bidding war flared up over the kimono she was wearing on the night in question, and people rushed to visit sites associated with the murder. And she was linked to what's known in Japanese folklore as dokufu, which means poison woman, a sexually vengeful woman who usually ends up killing her lover, which makes sense. The poison woman is attractive but dangerous, erotically charged, murderous. Every culture's got one. Like a siren, I suppose. But they're not beautiful, though. That's the point.
I guess alluring.
Their voices are, they're gross.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess some people could say maybe witches, there's something there because they could, I don't know, glamour themselves into looking attractive to lure men in. You know, there's some sort of parallel.
I guess Cersei's one. She was fit.
Yep, tick. And like Europe's witch trials and the US's satanic panic, these expressions of national fear are usually based on changing demographics. And with a woman's role once again in flux, post-war Japan took this poison woman story and ran with it. Among the aristocracy, it was a horror and a disgrace. But everywhere else, in the working class especially, this story was a subject of humour, sympathy, and even admiration. A fascination with what was known as erogura swept Japan. Oh, this is what it is. This is the thing that guy was into.
I just thought that, yeah.
Yeah. So it's essentially erotic grotesque. That's kind of what it's short for. And it basically saw people turn away from the large-scale, unimaginable horrors of war and delve into isolated, salacious personal stories closer to home. And Abe Sada's story was ready to be mythologized.
In 1946, women got the vote in Japan. There was a surge of feminist sympathy for Abe Sada, and she was recast as sort of a feminist hero. And the same year that women got the vote, author Angu Sakaguchi interviewed Abe Sada for a magazine. And he described her as a tender, warm figure and drove a lot more sympathy her way. The following year, another writer, Ichiro Kimura, wrote The Erotic Confessions of Abe Sada. It was based on her police interrogations, and it also claimed to be written with input from Abe Sada herself. And this book did not present her as a feminist hero, but rather a disturbed, perverted sadist, which I think is a lot closer to the truth.
Yeah. So Abe Sada quickly responded with her own autobiography, Memoirs of Abe Sada, in which she emphasized her love for Ishida. And this sold like hot sake. And a few years after that, Abe Sada got the acting bug. She toured the country, appearing as herself in a one-night, one-woman stage production. When that finally died down in about 1952, she started working in a bar in downtown Tokyo as a celebrity attraction.
Would I go and see her one-woman show? Yes, I would.
Sure.
I would go. I would see it.
I would come with you. I would absolutely come with you. But when she was working at this bar in Tokyo as the quote-unquote attraction, every night at 10 o'clock she would appear at the top of the stairs and glower across the room. The men would all clasp their hands over their privates and giggle to each other. Then...
Well, she's just become a cuckoo clock.
Yeah, basically. And then, as one account put it, quote, above the descending Abe Sada would mime fury, casting burning glances at those below, who squeezed and giggled the more. She slapped the banister in her wrath, and merriment rippled. After a while, Abe Sada, however, slipped into anonymity, disappearing from the public eye in the early 70s.
But she was never gone completely. Not even now. Even right now, as we are recording this, there is a working porn star named after Abe Sada. And to date, at least 6 films have been made based on her life, the most famous of which is Oshima Nagisa's In the Realm of the Senses. Oshima had been making sexy art house films for quite a while through the 60s, but he'd always been held back by Japan's famously very strict censorship. But then he went to the French to solve his problem. He went to Cannes and he met French filmmaker Anatole Dauman. Dauman convinced Oshima that they should make a French/Japanese joint production and go all out, sex-wise. And the film, In the Realm of the Senses, contains quite a significant amount of unsimulated sex between the actors. But it was enormously critically acclaimed once it was edited and developed overseas and is still a highly respected art house film. Japanese people still flock to see the censored version in cinemas, which is the only one they're allowed. And in fact, because Hawaii happens to be a very popular holiday destination for Japanese people, some Hawaiian cinemas showed In the Realm of the Senses on repeat every day for years. But to this day, it has never been shown uncensored in Japan itself. Oshima claims that while he was preparing to make the film, he wanted to find out whatever had happened to Abe Sada. And he claims that he eventually found her, at the age of 60, living in a nunnery in the Kansai countryside. Shaved head and everything. And she had dedicated her life to spiritual pursuits. And that is the last reported sighting of Abe Sada. We are pretty sure she died in that nunnery, although I would say that is quite good PR for your film.
Yeah, I'm also like, a nunnery? I don't believe she stopped shagging. Don't believe it for a second. But that's the end of the story of Japan's murderous geisha and poison woman, Abe Sada. So let's end this episode with what's the deal with Japanese sexuality today? Well, like we said at the start, half of women and a quarter of men aged 16 to 24 are apparently not interested in or despise sexual contact. More than 40% of Japanese people aged 18 to 34 are still virgins. Japan's already got one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And if 18 to 34-year-olds are not fucking, then that is definitely going to fall, some predict, by as much as another third. Japan's Institute of Population and Social Security reports an astonishing 90% of young women believe that staying single is, quote, preferable to what they imagine marriage to be like.
And I can tell you what they imagine marriage to be like. It's really not that far off salaryman and stay-at-home wife thing that's been around for almost ever. Japanese legislation has been slow to catch up with the modern world. That is a fact. The World Economic Forum consistently ranks Japan as one of the worst nations for gender equality at work. A lack of maternity and daycare options essentially mean that most women get pregnant and then they have to resign. They have no choice. 70% of Japanese women leave their jobs after having their first child. And even then, post-recession, having children can be impossible in a single-income household. So, on the other side, many men picture themselves working every spare minute of every day so they have just enough to drum up and support their family at home. And in a culture where casual, no-strings dating is a lot less common than it is here in the West, many young people drop sex altogether because it might lead to a long-term relationship they might not be able to get out of.
As for laws around sexual assault, change is slow. Victims know that the police and courts largely don't want to get involved. There's a culture of endurance and stoicism, and an unwillingness to disrupt social harmony that all combines to silence victims. And many victims, if they do report any sort of sexual assault in Japan, usually leave a lot unsaid. A government survey found that just 14% of victims of sexual assault in Japan reported the crime. So the statistics for sexual assault do remain incredibly low. Plus, sexual abuse is also not spoken about in the media, neither on the news nor in TV drama storylines, so it's just not that visible. But there is hope. Last year, just like in France, the definition of rape in Japan was officially changed. Previously, it only included non-consensual penetrative sex involving violence or intimidation. The new definition allows cases of drugging, intimidation, and psychological manipulation. It's still short of international standards, but it's definitely a start.
Depressing.
Oh no.
I've seen out of countries like Japan and Korea, this, we've spoken about this in Under the Duvet in sort of relation to 4B, and I'm not comparing Japan and Korea because they're very different places, but they are experiencing a similar phenomenon where the government's answer to the perilously low birth rate has been all of these pronatal policies where you'll get a tax break if you have this many children, or that's not the answer. The answer is make it possible for women to go back to work if they want to. That is what you should be doing. You shouldn't just be have more babies, stay in the house.
Yeah. No, and we've seen that backfire in other countries as well. Sweden very famously tried to introduce all of these very, very pro-natal policies, and basically it was about, offering the women all of these benefits if they had children. But actually what happened is it just made women who were in their 30s who haven't had children yet completely unemployable, because the companies are like, I don't want to fucking hire you because I know you will
Yeah.
have a child in the next 10 years and I'll be fucked. So it's, it's a difficult situation. And, coming back to Abe Sada as a case, it's a really, really fascinating story, because not only is it set against that backdrop of like the sexual oppression versus that kind of real strangeness to sex in Japan, it's also probably one of the cases, I would say, where it is a woman committing very, very traditionally masculine crimes. Like her mentality, her behavior, the grotesqueness of it, the violence of it, the brutality. We don't typically see these things in crimes perpetrated by women. And yeah, here you go. She ticks all the boxes and some. So a lot. There's a knee in your crotch for everybody at home.
Hey man, I'm just enlightening the people. Showing all a favor.
I'm here for it. So yeah, that is the case of Abe Sada, and hopefully a bit more of an understanding in, the barest of bones that we can do about geisha and what exactly that means and what it doesn't mean. And yeah, that's our little trip to Japan for today. Goodbye.
Arigato.